This conference will now be recorded.
Great.
Will, we can't hear you. You're muted.
Perfect. And right after we started recording.
Okay, it's Wayne Davis, everybody. Gate City Wheelers.
Will, you're muted again.
I think I'm getting muted here. Thank you, everyone, for joining the call. This is the first session in our webinar series, and we've pulsed our membership to figure out what are topics that they're interested in hearing from some of our experts in the organization. So this is going to be the first of many sessions that we set up and communicate, and I'm really excited to have such a strong turnout for this first session. We're going to record the session, and we're going to begin posting these also online in order to try to bring some value back to all of the members. And kicking off the session is going to be Christina Schwab. She's doing a practicum experience with us here at the NWBA over the summer, and she's going to introduce the topic and our presenters. So Chris, thank you so much.
Now you're muted.
Chris, you're still muted.
Hey, Brandon, maybe you can unmute her mic so that she can kick us off here.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Can we still see the PowerPoint?
Yes. It's
Okay.
It's just like slides. It will be fine. Yeah, you're good.
Okay. All right. So hi again. And thanks, Will, for introducing me. I'm Christina. I'm going to be the moderator for tonight. So we're excited that you guys are joining us for this first installment of our webinar series. And as Will said, we're going to have some other ones going on throughout the summer. So we're excited to, have this be informative and useful for your upcoming seasons and beyond. Just before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. So everybody attending tonight is going to be muted during the presentation. If you have any questions, I want to point you guys to the chat box. We're going to be monitoring that throughout the presentation. So we'll have some time at the end to go over some questions and answers. And then if you can't make it or stay with us throughout this presentation, we will have a recording up on the NWBA website. So those are just my housekeeping things. I do want to introduce to you our experts in the field of grant writing. So kicking us off tonight is going to be Darlene Hunter and Cheryl Vines, and I want to tell you a little bit about them. So Darlene serves as the president of the NWBA Women's Division. She has a long history in wheelchair basketball as both an athlete and an advocate. She's been very successful in grant writing and has written several grants to advance adaptive sports for community programming and camps. Darlene is currently an assistant professor in practice for social work at UTA and is a member of Team USA's women's wheelchair basketball team and a gold medalist from the 2016 Paralympic Games in Rio. And then Cheryl here with us is the Director of Research and Education at Paralyzed Veterans of America. In that role, she oversees the grant portfolios for the PVA Research Foundation and the Education Foundation, as well as managing PVA's research and education initiatives. She began her work in grant management as an applicant, obtaining over $8.3 million in her career. Pretty awesome. Cheryl began her career as a rec therapist and is a strong proponent for recreation opportunities and leisure education for people with spinal cord disabilities. And she's held numerous roles with us at the NWBA for over the past 4 decades. So I want to thank you both for being here and being a part of the series. And we're excited to learn from you both. And I will turn it over to you guys now.
Turning my clock on. Well, thank you, Christine, and thank you, Will. It's a great pleasure for me to work with Darlene and to work with the NWBA again after maybe a little hiatus. I think that this is an important topic. Finding money for teams is nothing new. Everybody's been looking for money since I've been involved. I do feel, as we used to say in Arkansas, I do feel a little bit like I'm preaching to the choir, because I think there's a number of people that are here on this call who have been excellent grant writers and excellent fundraisers for their programs, from legislative initiatives to different kinds of grants. So hopefully they'll have an opportunity to share experience, and hopefully you'll still learn something. I always feel like if you can take away 3 things, if we could switch to the next slide, if you can take away 3 things, oh, and one more, please, there. From a presentation, you're good. So these are the 3 things that we want you to take away tonight. That you're going to be able to describe 3 key elements of selecting and writing a grant. That you're going to be able to name 1 funding technique or 1 funding resource that you think might apply to your program, and that you'll be able to define what program evaluation is, because I think that's one of the things that really catches people up when they're looking at writing grants, and it's sometimes a little bit intimidating. The next slide, please. So I think that it's really important when you're talking about funding your team's program to have a diverse way of raising money. You should not depend on one holy grant. You should not depend on one donor or one sponsor for your program, because if one of those drop out for whatever reason, you can really be sunk. So a good team or a good program has a diverse background. They have sponsors, they have people that donate, they have in-kind donations, they have grants, they have contributions from the people that are participating in the program and their families. So today we're just going to talk about grants. And when we talk about grants, the worst grant I ever saw was one that started off, if you give us the money, we will do this. So my first question when I read that line was, if we don't give you the money, are you not going to have a program? Is it not going to exist? When grantors give funds or give partnerships or want to support an organization, it's because they think that they have something going for them and that they're going to be able to carry out a program. You have the idea, you have the program. So when you're talking about grants, when you're talking about funding, talk about players, talk about teams, talk about your program, talk about those outcomes that we're all looking for in terms of successes. Don't talk about how many dollars. You get to the dollars later on, and while they're important, when you're actually trying to convince somebody to buy into your mission, or that your mission is consistent with theirs, you really need to talk about something besides dollars. So if we could go to the next slide. Many of you know about writing grants and preparing to write grants. My first grant was for $150. I got it from an independent living center, and it funded a spinal cord injury support group that we were running. It paid $5 a week for people to get the dial-a-ride to come to the program. The biggest grant that I ever got was $2.7 million from the Centers for Disease Control to do a pressure sore prevention intervention in Arkansas, which I have to say was very successful and actually has been imitated in other countries. So that's the one probably that one of the ones I'm most proud of. Along the way, I actually we won't talk about what year, but a long time ago, when players actually had to pay their own way to compete in the Paralympics, I wrote a grant so that 6 players could get funded to go to Barcelona. And that allowed them to be able to participate on the USA team. Thank goodness the funding and the big grants for those kinds of things are done at the NGO level now and not at the player level. But that kind of gives you a little history of where I've come from. So as you prepare to look for a grant, you need to think about what kind of funding you have now. Where are the holes in what you're doing? You know, do you have plenty of equipment, but getting to those tournaments is a big problem? Do you have people that'll pay for transportation and those kind of things, but it's just getting those chairs that you need that are a problem? So you need to really think about what you need, not what you want, but what you need. I would challenge you to be able to tell me right now when we can't do it. This is one of the things I don't like about this platform, instead of being able to do it in person, so I can't point fingers and say how much was yours. But think about, how much did you spend this season? Could you tell me how many dollars you actually spent, your team actually spent on the season? And if you had to include in the in-kind or the family contributions, how much would that be? So those are the kinds of things. Now, those of you that work in universities probably have a well lined out budget, and you probably get a report on that every week or month. But most people that are running not-for-profits don't always have that. So I think it's really important for you to have that information. So if somebody came along and said, I want to sponsor you guys next season, what'll it take? You can tell them a realistic number, and you can tell them how it breaks down. I mean, those opportunities don't come very often, but you need to be prepared for when they do. So that's what I call, and again, I'm really old school. I'm proud of it. I talk about the 3-minute elevator speech, you know, your program description. What if somebody asks you, honestly, and particularly in these times, 3 minutes is like a lifetime, because everybody wants to hear everything like really, really quickly. So if you have 3 minutes with somebody to explain what it is that you're doing, then you need to be succinct, you need to be detailed, you need to give examples, you need to be able to do that. So, and not only you, the people that are sitting here that are writing the grants, need to be able to do that, but so do your coaches, so do your players. Anybody that might get asked about your program needs to be able to talk about the program easily, quickly, succinctly, because that's what will allow you to kind of move forward and to use every opportunity that you have. Next slide. When we get down to the nitty-gritty, these are the things you have to know that you have to be a good grant applicant. You need to know if you're a not-for-profit organization and if you're registered both with your state and with the IRS. There are ways to go about finding that out. But if you don't have the documents that show that you are registered with the state and the IRS, you should go about getting those documents. You also need to make sure that you have a 501c3 tax exempt designation. I've been involved in setting up, in developing several organizations. Lots of people, it's easy to get a 501c3. You can go on LegalZoom tonight and access a 501, apply for a 501c3. Getting a tax exempt designation is a long and strenuous process. The IRS does some trainings on how to get that exemption. You have to have a lot of details. You actually have to be able to plan for the next 5 years. You have to tell them not only what you think you're going to spend this year, but what you think you're going to spend in the next 5 years in order to get a tax exempt status. So if you don't have it, be prepared and get one. If you're a program of another organization, people talk about being a sports program or the wheelchair basketball team, but really when you dig back to that 501c3, they're part of an independent living center. They're funded, they're using a hospital's foundation funding for their 501c3. If you're using those, then when you apply for a grant, you have to include that information. You have to let them know that the ILC makes $1 million or brings in about $1 million a year, but your wheelchair basketball program is $50,000 of that. So, oftentimes, because they're going to look and you're going to be asked to provide your EIN number, you're going to be asked to provide perhaps your 990 or make the 990 available to them, which is a form that all not-for-profit organizations that make over a certain amount of money each year need to submit to the IRS. It's like a tax, it's like paying your taxes. You don't have to pay taxes, but it's like, you know, filling out your tax return. Do you have a presence? Are you on a web? Do you have a website? Do you have a Facebook page? When I review grants for any of the organizations that I review grants for, the first thing I do, or one of the things I do, is go to that organization's website. Number one, you'll probably be asked to give your web address, just like you're asked to give your email address and that kind of thing. And you'll need to be able to, and I want to see, you know, if you're talking about having a sports program, then I go to your website and I don't see anything about wheelchair basketball there, then, or I don't see the names of any of the people that you've listed as your staff people, then I'm going to start thinking, well, you know, how does this fit into that organization? So it's really important to have a website. It's really not fun to go to a website in 2020 and the last things that are listed in there was the 2018 season. So keeping your website updated, as we know with the NWBA and with all of our other organizations, is really important. Doesn't have to be fancy, but it has to be up to date. And then you need to decide who's your fiscal agent going to be, because it has to be somebody that you can trust. I can't tell you the number of not-for-profit organizations, PVA chapters, other groups who have put their trust in someone who went on a trip to the Bahamas on the account, was going to pay it back, but didn't. So finding that person, and it may not be one of your players, it may be somebody's dad, somebody's uncle, someone at another not-for-profit, or an accountant, or someone that you know who's willing to play the dad, if you will, and really hold the organization's feet to the fire when it comes to spending the money for the things that you said you were going to spend the money for. So if you have all of those things, then you're set and you can start looking for grants. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Hunter, to talk about that because she's really good at it.
Christina, can you go to the next slide? Okay, thanks. So if all of you have seen me like on the internet and stuff, I always try to share as much grants that come across my desk so that you all can benefit from them. So searching for the dollar is kind of my thing. So the first thing is like know what you need, like Cheryl has already said, and be able to describe it and measure it. I think the big thing is like people can describe what they need, but we don't have a way of measuring it. And with grants, they look for program evaluation. How is this going to be sustainable? How do you know what you say is going to happen actually happen? And then do your research, make a budget. So if you say you want a van or a wheelchair basketball chair, like go to the company and ask for quotes so you know exactly how much it is going to cost. They want to make sure that you know that the budget is realistic, not just one that you're inflating because you're going to take this money and do travel. Because once you write what the budget and the quote is, they're expecting you to spend the money exactly that way. Like Cheryl said, have a data and a face. So social media websites in your website, social media, like your front page of your social media and your website is probably the most important at first because you're telling the story. I know that if information on page 2, 3, and 4 aren't updated, it starts to look questionable. We have team pictures I've seen on some websites that like kids are in high school and they're still the prep kids pictures, right? So make sure that you keep that up to date and have an evaluation method of how you're going to test how fast they get, or like if you need cones or you're going to do something, like figure out your evaluation method, and we'll talk about that later in this presentation. Position yourself to make the ask. Like I know there's a lot of people who hate to sell themselves, right? Like I'm not that person who's going to go ask for money. This is when you have to be a champion or find somebody to be a champion for your program. You have to find that person who is not afraid to ask for money, who wants the best of it. And it also puts yourself like a video together or pictures together so that you can see like your kids and making them look like we know kids self. So I always try to make them like my front page of anything. And then get permission or ask for forgiveness. I know there are times where I'm like, oh, if I get permission, this may not work out the same way, but I'm going to move forward and ask for forgiveness later. So within your organizations, you got to know how to walk that line. And then determine your best option for success. Like, what is it that is going to get you the farthest? Is it, you know, getting the transportation going, or is it getting the wheelchairs, like Cheryl said? Next slide, Christina. And then this is kind of what Cheryl has already gone over. Like, are you ready? Do you even have a 501(c)(3)? Are you borrowing it from somebody else? Are you on a I know there's some people who have a parent organization and they're the child organization. You got to make sure that you're not both applying for the same grant. This is where communication comes in. I know that at a lot of the universities, if the university is applying for that grant, then our little team at the university can apply for that grant. So you have to be able to communicate with everybody and that about who is going to be the lead. Can I make my grant and your grant the same underneath you? Like, can we partner together versus just putting 2 grants? Because Cheryl, I don't know if she'll tell the story later in the presentation, but she like had somebody who both worked, like it was the same nonprofit, 2 different people applied and didn't talk to each other at all. So that's the other thing is, are you ready? Did you talk to somebody to make sure that you're the only people applying for that grant? And then somebody who has to take the lead role of making sure the funds are spent in the outline manner. It's not only the person who's financially responsible for the bank account, but the person who is going to make sure that your forms are filled out on time, that you meet the deadline, that you do the follow through. Because as we go through, we'll show you all the different stages of like letters of interest and then those approvals. You have to make sure that it's somebody who's going to keep up to date with all of that information. So it's more than just the financial part. There's a lot of other paperwork that is turned in, and you want that the person who they're going to ask and continue to contact will actually respond and communicate. How quickly do you need the funds? Grants are not quick. Grants, you are basically writing grants for next year. You're not writing grants for right now. And then is fundraising more feasible than a grant at this time? So can you do a popcorn sale or a GoFundMe page or a gala or a golf tournament if you need the fund immediately versus long-term? Because a lot of the grants take a year to get through them, process them, and then find out if you get the money. Go ahead, Christina. So also, Cheryl kind of talked about the mission statement. Don't make up a new mission statement just to get the grant. Like, we can't just keep altering what we are standing for to try to fit into those grants. Grantors will search the website, but they'll also, when you do a 501(c), you have to turn in what your mission is, so they can pull it from the IRS as well. And then grants don't pay for everything. So you can't get a $1,000 or $100,000 grant and think that everything is going to be fine. A lot of grants don't pay for administration costs. They don't pay for salaries. A lot of like Christopher Reeves Foundation will pay more for equipment than it will for anything else. So it doesn't really pay for travel, but Craig H. Nielsen will pay for more of the travel. So you have to find how the grants can all pair together to make the best success for your program. So you also have to know, like, a lot of times they don't want to see more than 10% of your grant go to overhead costs or salaries and benefits, that kind of thing. They want most of the money to immediately impact the program. So when you're writing the grant, think about it that way as well. Christina, next slide. And then grants are not free money. It's not like if you do a GoFundMe page or you do in-kind donations where a lot of that money can be spent however you need it and fill in those missing gaps. Grants, whatever you outline of how much money you're going to spend for a wheelchair basketball chair or for travel or a tournament, it has to pretty much meet that standards. You can go back later, like let's say during COVID, right now is a perfect example of what's happening. We all had this money to go to nationals, or we had this money to do camps, and we couldn't use it that way because COVID shut everything down. So then you go back to your grantors and talk to them and be like, how I couldn't spend the money in this way, but you don't get to just make that decision on your own. If they've given you the money for a camp and you can't spend it in that way, have that conversation back with them. A lot of them are really flexible and will let you use it in a different way if you've outlined it, but you can't just keep saying, oh, I need this money for somewhere else, I'm gonna pull it. And then many grantors have requirements about the organization that receives the money. So some, the VA or the veteran money, a lot of that and is you need a DUNS number, so that's another step in this. Is it a government entity? Is it not-for-profit? So when you're going through those grants, if you apply and you don't meet the standards, you're pretty much going to be denied. So that's where you don't waste your time if you don't fit there. Go ahead, Christina. And so most grantors require the sign off by like a CEO, CFO. With our nonprofits, sometimes they're labeled as presidents or chairs. So don't wait until you've done the whole grant and you filled it all out and then go to your administrator and be like, oh, please sign this. And then they're like, what is this? And then you did all that hard work without that buy-in. Make sure you get that buy-in early. You want them to be on your side. You want them to be able to approve this, because the quicker they can sign it, then you're not stressing on the deadline. I know we have a lot of procrastinators, me included. I like to push that line to the very last minute. But with grant writing, that's really difficult, because if you have technology errors or somebody is not available, they get sick, you can't sign something, it's a problem. And then like Cheryl is already listed, we listed them on this slide for you. The organization will, like for the grants, they'll usually require you to turn in this following information. And a lot of it is with our type of grants that we write, they want to know the breakdown of your disabilities. A lot of the grants, if you're SCIs or spina bifida, they want to know that. That's why, like the NWBA, I suggest like when you register, you see their form where they're asking about all the different disabilities. That's a good outline to use so that you know, like, there's grants for different disabilities. So when you're searching, think about that too, like not just writing about adapted sports, but thinking about the different disabilities like amputees, cancer kids, all cancer adults, gunshots. Those open the door to more grants as well. So the number of clients served and the type of disability is also really helpful in opening up more grants. Go ahead, Christina. And then, so you want to make sure, we kind of talked about this, that your organization's mission statement must be consistent with the mission of the grantor. We don't want to make up new ones, and then grants don't pay for everything. So go ahead, Christina. I don't know why that was. And then this is just kind of a graph for you all to see how the writing process of a grant happens. The dashed lines on the screen are ones that may or may not be requirements of the grant, but the bold-faced ones usually are the most important parts in the requirements. So identify a new focus, find the prospective grants, develop general proposal and budget. And as you go through this workflow, you'll see that it continues, because every year you have to redo this, or constantly throughout the year. Looking for grants, there's a lot of due dates that are due October 1st, because that's a fiscal year for a lot of organizations that give money. And then you got another, like January is the big one, and then March ends up being another. So there's like 3 big months that grants are usually due. Cheryl is for the next slide, Christina.
Okay, so we've talked about some of these kinds of things about figuring out what you want first. And almost every grant you're going to apply for is going to ask you to give them a statement of need. So, and a statement of need isn't, I need these things. A statement of need is a description of the problem, basically. So the statement of need is going to say things like, there are no other programs in Central Arkansas. This is a disability population that is, for the most part, low income. And so players and participants have a difficult time accessing the expensive equipment and the travel and those kinds of things that they need. Don't be afraid to use statistics, but if you use them, make sure that they're most up-to-date statistics. So you can find out what the average income in your state is. You can find out how many people who live with disabilities, kids or adults or both, in your city or your county or the catchment area that you're going to recruit people to participate in your program. But a statement of need usually starts out with a statement of the problem. There are few opportunities for people with disabilities to participate in recreation and team sports in Arkansas. Though our population of people with disabilities is higher than the national average, we have few programs to support those individuals. And then go on to talk about what you want to put in. So, you want to describe what's not there, and then talk about what should be there, and then talk about what you're going to do to fix that problem. So you want to describe a need. The other thing that you want to do is to be realistic in when you're describing your grant. So people go in and say, gosh, this is the first grant I've applied for to Nielsen. I could apply for $100,000. I have a team of 14 people. Well, heck, let's just go for the 100,000. Well, unless you're going to buy a Sprinter van, we're going to have a pretty difficult time trying to figure out how you're going to spend $100,000 in a little over 6 months on those 14 people, because most teams don't stay, at the Four Seasons. So it's really important to think, and if you're applying for a grant the first time, be realistic about how many people you're going to serve and how much money you think you can ask for. Think about it per person. And I would say that if you're looking at a program, you would never want to look at more than $1,000 per person unless you're buying equipment, and then it's another story. But you want to keep that amount to about $1,000 or less per person. As you get bigger groups, if you're running a national tournament, then you might not even be able to do that much. But it's really important that you look at how you're going to spend the money, and you don't overpromise. So you don't say, we're a wheelchair basketball team, and what we really want to do is recruit 10 new players or 5 new players this year, and get them the equipment that they need, or get equipment so that players can try out new equipment, and travel to a couple tournaments or travel to the national tournament. I read a wheelchair basketball application one time that was very zealous, and they said, we're going to start a new team, a new D3 team, and we need funds to do this, this, and this, which were all very realistic. And then the last item on the list was, and we're going to go to the national tournament that the first year that we exist. And so we need this much money to go to the nationals. And, I thought it was unrealistic. My colleagues thought that it was very optimistic. So they thought it was a good thing. But we can go to the next page, please. So when you're doing all this, you're going to pull together your documents. But as you're preparing to write the grant, the next step, once you decide what you want to do, is pull together your documents. Darlene had a really good suggestion that you put all those documents in a Dropbox or a Google Drive or a shared drive, so that everybody that needs to look at them can have them available to them, that just one person doesn't have all of the things. You're going to, grant writing, somebody famous once said it takes a village, and I think it takes a village to write a grant. One person sitting in a room does not ever do a very good job of writing a grant. They need to get input, whether different people write different parts, or you just get together and brainstorm and pull together your ideas. It's really good to bring all of the different philosophies, both internally, your players and your families, as well as externally, those people who might be your other supporters. what do they think? It's not bad to bring us, if you have a sponsor that's giving you a few $1,000s a year, if you said, so you're giving us $3,000 a year, we're thinking we're going to use that money for hosting the big tournament of the year, and we're going to put your name on it. But we're thinking about asking this other organization to help us buy wheelchairs. What do you think about that? Sponsor might say, well, heck, I didn't know you needed wheelchairs. Let me just pay for those too. Or they might say, wow, that's great. We can continue to help you with this piece if you get some additional money from the other piece. If you're going to have external partners, if the YMCA is going to donate gym space to you, or a church is going to donate gym space to you, or an organization has agreed to loan you vehicles or rent you vehicles at a discounted rate, then you need to develop those relationships in advance so that, again, like she said about talking to your CFO or your board director or board president, you don't want to come at the last minute and say, oh, by the way, would you write us a letter of recommendation or a letter of support saying that you'll do this for our grant? And then, if I'm that person, I'm going to say, what grant? And what are you getting us into? And, those kinds of things. One really good way to get letters of support is to write a letter of support that looks like what you want them to write, that tells them who to send it, who to address it to, the brief summary of your grant, and then it says XYZ Medical will provide this, this, and this during the 2021 season. So that, they can take it, they can change it, they can embellish it, or they can just sign it, put it on their letterhead and sign it. But that's one really good way to get people to do a letter of support, because looking at a piece of white paper and trying to figure out how to start off a letter, if you're not someone that does that all the time, is kind of a hard thing to do. So we think I think that's really important. Doing your research, we talked about that, making sure that there's not other things that are going on, making sure that nobody else is applying to do what you're doing in your community for your same population. It's okay if 2 people in Chicago are applying for wheelchair basketball grants. That's not a big deal. But if 2 people are applying to fund one team, 2 organizations are applying, and they both are funding one team, then, we're probably going to catch up with it and say, wait a minute, is it this group or is it that group? And they're asking for this funding and they're asking this funding. How do we decide which one gets it? And grants take a long time. There's a few of you here that have written grants. I would say a small grant would take you at least 10 or 12 hours. A big grant is probably going to take you 20 or 30 hours of time. That $2.7 million grant, it took a lot of time. It took weeks. Next, please.
Okay, so the biggest challenge for most grant writers, and I think especially our population, is actually finding the funds, right? Everybody's like, how do you find them? And I think that I find them by like what other organizations present on. So if I find like somebody's like, oh, I got this grant, then I kind of look at their grants that they get and then find the loop, like the pockets in them. We know that some are area, like I send the grants that I find here in Texas that are really for Minnesota or Illinois, like I send them to people. So I think of us all as a community that we share resources. Like if you find a grant that's valuable to Texas, I don't just ignore it. I like send it on to the person. The other thing is with this is the new industry. Sorry, I was reading Cheryl's comment. So priorities change. So Walmart Foundation, we're seeing this a lot right now with COVID, is that the organizations change what they're covering. Right now, a lot of people are doing social justice, right? So all the grant money that we were used to getting for certain things from that organization or nonprofit or funding profit organization is changed to social justice. So that might change some of our revenue streams this year. It's something that we have to think about as we move forward. Christina, next slide. So this is a list I just made. It was really quick. So know that there's national, state, and regional grants, and as well as local funding streams. So there are community foundations. You could probably get them per state, where you might be able to apply to that community foundation for a grant. You could apply to your city council for a grant, and or all the way up to national grants. I try sometimes as a region of the state of Texas. I think we have 5 or junior programs and like 7 adult programs. So can we sometimes, we have an organization that tries to write a grant for the whole region and then distribute money that way for camps and different different things to help out. We buy basketball chairs. So how can we as conferences utilize grant writing to help our own conference? So we get the national, state, regional. So I think we all need to start thinking about not just our own nonprofit and our own team, but how can I partner with others? Because then your number served goes up as well, right? So if I could get more of that population by working with a team in my conference, how does that benefit me in the long run? Can we do a tournament where we could apply for this grant as a whole regional organization, and that might get more tournaments in our area to fly those refs in and stuff. So Google is always your friend. And so like, these are some of the things that I have, keywords I've used. I think it's really important, like disability is a vulnerable population. We're a marginalized population. We're low income. So when you think of those those words, you open up more grants than just like disability, adapted sports. Everybody kind of applies for the adapted sports disability grant. We all know what they are. I think everybody on this call can probably list them out. So how do we start looking at those others? We are a marginalized population. We are the vulnerable population. So start using those words when looking for grants. And then we kind of listed some state and national grants that you haven't think of. I know in our organization, we've used Variety Children's Charities grant and applied that way to get a lot of our kids through travel. So most states have a chapter, so it might be a relationship if you haven't built for children. That's a good one. PVA is a good one for adults. So start thinking a little bit more outside the box. Next slide. And then I always, like if we have a rehab hospital or like a children's hospital, look at their board, see how much of their board members, this was the best piece of advice somebody once gave me, is like, look at board members at those hospitals. Are they funding to disabled people? If not, have a conversation with those board members to try to get your niche as part of them. If you have colleagues or friends, we had another nonprofit, it's called Extraordinary Is, that's local, and it was a friend that worked with somebody who started a nonprofit and wanted to give us a grant. So it was more of just conversations of like, once they hear of really cool things that we do, then their nonprofit, they're like, oh, I have a nonprofit, we want to fund that. And so it's more of building those relationships and networking. But this is, finding funding is always the biggest challenge and barrier for everybody to overcome. And with the grants, what we were saying is like, no square pegs do not fit in round holes. So just because you find a funder does not mean they always meet your needs. So make sure that you, for grants, you meet what they're saying. Next slide. And then writing the proposal. So we've kind of gone over this, is look at your eligibility, look at the funding level. Like Cheryl says, $150 is just as valuable for small grants as those $100,000. Don't put all your money in one basket, because if you don't get it, then your whole program is not going to flow the next year. We had a student here who applied for a scholarship, like $1,000 scholarship. They were only going to give it to 2 people. It was such a small scholarship, no one else applied for it. He ended up getting both of the 2 people's scholarships. So he got $2,000 just because he was willing to put the work in where no one else applied. So those little ones, a lot of times people are like, oh, I'm not going to waste my time on it. And once you write a grant once, kind of what Cheryl said, like you can use it again in the future. It's hardest to write the initial part, but then they all kind of need the same thing. Next one. And then know that you will probably need a letter of intent, an abstract, a narrative, an evaluation, and a budget. Those are kind of the staples for every grant, and be prepared with that. That's why I say that common drive, because once you kind of get this stuff out of already, like the narrative, the need, all of that, then you can pull for that quickly for future grants. Next slide. Cheryl, this is you.
So when I retired a few years ago, the Craig H. Nielsen Foundation invited me to serve on their Creating Opportunities and Independence, which those of you that have been around for a little while remember is their Quality of Life grants. So I've been a reviewer for them for about 8 years, and it's been a wonderful opportunity. There are very few granting organizations where you don't really have a pay line. Usually, if you're on a grant review committee, you'll come up with all these grants that have great scores, and then we'll say, okay, but we only have this many dollars. Where do we cut off? Where are we going to stop? The Nielsen Foundation is extremely well funded. If we had a little more time, I would tell you about Craig H. Nielsen, because he was a very fascinating person. Suffice to say, he was a real estate and casino mogul who got in a car crash, became a quadriplegic, wanted to find a way to cure paralysis and improve the lives of people living with spinal cord injury. So when he died about 20 years late after his spinal cord injury, his whole estate went to the Craig H. Nielsen Foundation. So they are exceptionally well funded, like 400 or 500 million. I don't know. With the latest issues, it may be less, but at least $400 million. And people smarter than me could tell you how much money they make on $400 million each year. And I think they try to give away at least that. So the Nielsen Foundation, in the area of creating opportunities and independence, funds about $3 million worth of grants every year. This is the schedule. I don't need to talk about it. It will be on these slides. They'll be available to you on the website. But as Darlene said, it takes a long time. People that applied last fall are just finding out, or in January, are just finding out, won't find out until September whether they received a Nielsen Foundation grant for this year. Can we go to the next slide, please? So I want to talk just briefly about the 4 big pieces or 5 big pieces of a grant, because these are things that Nielsen requires. A letter of intent is a great thing. It's a great thing to you as the grant applicant. It's a great thing to the granting organization. Basically, it's used for screening purposes. They want to see if somewhere between 250 and 500 words, about 2 pages in a budget, whether you can describe what it is that you want to do and how you're going to do it and what it's going to cost in that short amount of information, or that short format, in order for them to sort of make a basic decision. It takes me about 2.5 hours to review a Nielsen Foundation grant. It takes me about 20-30 minutes to review a letter of intent. So our time is best used for the hundreds of applications that they get to look at letters of intent first. I would say most organizations, about half of the applications that come in make it past letter of intent. And that's on the federal level as well as with organizations that are not for profit. So you submit this, you put it together, you submit it by the deadline, you hear yes or yay or nay in a fairly short amount of time. And if you hear yes, then you'll go on to write a full grant application, or FGA we call them. If no, then you'll know that it wasn't an idea that they were interested in, or you didn't get your message across well. The problem is with an LOI, you don't usually get much feedback, so you don't know which one of those it is. That's the minus of LOIs. And the one hint I can give you about those, everybody's trying to make them really short and sweet, so they start using acronyms. Don't use acronyms unless you write it out at least once, because it's really hard for us to go back and try to figure out what you're talking about if you're just using initials for things that we may not be familiar with. So the next one. So if you're invited to write an application, a full grant application, the first piece of it, the first thing that the reviewer sees is the abstract. And that's the Cliff Notes, or that's the short version of what your grant is about. That's kind of like that elevator speech I talked about. Again, you're going to have probably less than 500 words, but about a page, and you're going to need to talk about what your mission is, your little bit about your statement of need that we talked about. You're going to talk about the highlights of your narrative to give people information. You're going to describe your need, but you're not going to talk about budget detail. There should not be a number of, there could be a number of people. You want to talk about who your target audience is in the abstract, but you don't want to talk about the budget. And an abstract should always end with a strong statement. So for example, the one I kind of put together yesterday was, with the support of the XYZ Foundation, we can provide educational, recreational, and competitive wheelchair basketball opportunities for 40 new and present athletes in Central Arkansas. So that's the bottom line. This is what we're going to do in this grant. An abstract, I always write the abstract last. After I've written the whole grant, I come back and write the abstract, because I know what I'm going to say. If you write the abstract first and then try to expand on it, sometimes it's a little bit harder. But you know what your narrative says, so you can come back and just really cut and paste out of your narrative into your abstract. But I can tell you for certain that most when grants get reviewed, you usually have a grant panel, and whether those people are peer reviewers that are hired, if they're people like me that sit on a board, if they're recruited from other organizations, or it's a group of organizations, typically 2 people will read your whole application. And those are going to be the only 2 that know everything about your grant. They will make recommendations and they will give it a score. The other half a dozen reviewers will typically listen to what those people have to say. And where do we go to get the Cliff Note? We're going to go to the abstract. So I'm going to read, if somebody else has reviewed the grant and we're discussing it, I'm going to bring up immediately the abstract, so I just have the high points of what it's going to do. So the abstract is really important. Next slide. The narrative is the meat and potatoes of your project. This is where you're going to describe everything about the project. You're going to talk, it's going to ask for that statement of need. Every grant will give you headings, and use those headings. If it says statement of need, target audience, impact on veterans, timeline, goals and objectives, timeline, program evaluation, dissemination, whatever that topic is, it should also have a little sentence of description after it about what they want you to talk about there. Put those headings in and talk about just that thing under each piece, because it's really important that we be able to find the things that we need. So I know on a Nielsen Foundation grant that if I want to know how many people they're going to serve, I go to like 4D in the narrative to find out how many people they're going to serve. And we want to be able to find things easily, so it's really important. And it's easier for you because if you filled in all the blanks or filled in each section, you know that you have all the pieces that we're looking for to make a decision. Next, please. So in terms of a program evaluation, I think a program evaluation is a really important piece of a grant. The real definition is a systematic assessment of the processes and outcomes of a program to determine its effectiveness, its efficiency, as well as promoting program development and improvement. So program evaluation should not only be something that you include so that you can tell, we talk about if you don't know where you're going, you're never going to get there. Well, your program evaluation is going to help you with that. So to include program evaluation, you want to talk about and document your processes. So if you tell people that you're going to buy 14 wheelchairs and you're going to do 2 outreach events and you're going to do a camp, then part of your program evaluation is, did you do it, and did you do it in the time frame that you said you were going to do it? If you missed a piece, if there's some big piece of what you said you were going to do and you didn't do it, then you really need to look at your process. Either, as Darlene said, sometimes things change. You might have to change your request, or sometimes you need to just go back and do the piece that you haven't done. You need to collect data for program evaluation. This doesn't have to be a really detailed, it doesn't have to be a researcher's data. You can have subjective data, and that's what people say about your program. If you ask people, did you have a good time? What was the most important thing that happened to you on this trip? Have you improved? How much do you think your skills have improved over the course of the season? There's lots of questions you can ask people, but we're asking it to know about individuals, basically, in a subjective data. Objective data is numbers. So you should be counting. So if part of your grant is a tournament, then you want to count how many players were at that tournament, how many family members were at that tournament, how many spectators were at that tournament, so that you don't say we had a tournament for 4 teams. If you say you had a tournament for 4 teams, you get one picture. If you say we had a tournament for 4 teams, there were 80 players, maybe 60, let's say 60 players, 47 family members, and 200 people in the stands. So for this tournament, I don't know what that all adds up to, but somewhere around 300 or 400 people benefited from attending this tournament. You get a much bigger picture. So you want to have those kinds of things. If you buy 6 program chairs and you're using them for players to get an opportunity to try out chairs, then you want to know how many players use those chairs at every practice. So we bought 6 chairs, but 60 different people got an opportunity to try out wheelchair basketball using these 6 chairs. So people begin to see how what they're doing is bigger than the individual thing. Anecdotes are always good. My favorite anecdote is I got a grant from the Nielsen Foundation to do home modifications and do ramps at people's houses. And so every time we built a ramp, and we finished up a ramp at somebody's house, and they were $5,000 a piece, 20 ramps, $100,000. This was my 3rd Nielsen grant. So I asked this one young man, I said, what would you like me to tell the Nielsen Foundation about what this ramp means to you? And he looked right at me and he said, Miss Cheryl, you just tell him it got me out of jail. I have been in the jail of my house for the last 2 years since I got hurt. And now I can get to the sidewalk. And if I can get to the sidewalk, I can get anywhere. Well, that was a pretty powerful message. That was a pretty powerful anecdote that gave, basically told the story of everything we were trying to do with this grant. So that's something we included in our final report. I didn't get it early enough for before that. And then I think it's always useful to include pictures in your program evaluation, because not only will the granting organization use this to look at your program, determine whether you were successful, determine whether you completed what you were doing, but hopefully you'll be able to use it. You'll say, well, gosh, we used this chair. We got 60 kids to use this chair, these chairs this year. Let's see if we can get 100 next year, or 70, or move it on up. But that's how you do program evaluation, is you look at how it impacts individuals, you look at how it impacts the group, and you look how you can describe it to people. I don't think that there's any use. I mean, when we do other kinds of grants, like when we do research grants at PVA, people that do clinical grants, they'll do a life satisfaction survey, they'll do a quality of life survey, they'll do all these surveys on people. And it's really nice to be able to say, it would be really nice to be able to say, well, these players at the beginning of the season, their quality of life was a 3.5, and at the end of the season, it was a 4.0. But unfortunately, you really can't say, you can say that over that 6-month period, but you can't say it was because they participated in wheelchair basketball. You'd like to think it has an impact, but you can really only say that players on our team had an improvement in their quality of life. You know, we don't know if they got married. We don't know if they got divorced. We don't know, you know, what they did that improved their quality of life. But hopefully, you know, winning a national championship or winning more games than they won last year had some impact on it. So I don't think you need to ask those kinds of questions. I don't think they lend themselves to adaptive sports programs at all. And next, and I think we're going to my colleague to, oh no, I'm still talking about program evaluation. So here's some measurable goals. 15 kids will attend a camp. We'll recruit 5 new players by this date. We'll purchase 10 new chairs. As I said, you need to be a little bit be aware of the touchy-feely things because you can't really categorize those easily. But you know, you've got that person that's going to take care of your money. You've got that person that's going to make sure that the goals happen. You want to find that person. Maybe they're all the same person, but you want to find that person who's going to keep track of all of these details and coordinate your program evaluation. It's not as ominous as it sounds. Next. And now I'm turning it over to my colleague to talk about budgets.
So the budget is the make or break of your proposal, right? Because it reflects that you actually thought ahead enough and know how much this is going to cost, and you're not just throwing a bunch of numbers out there at people. And this is where, you know, you are relying on other people to send you back some budget or like quotes and stuff. So this takes time too. This is why it's not just go wait to the last minute, because if you send a basketball wheelchair company a quote, it might take them a few days to get it back to you. And so it's things like how much your wheels cost, if you need tools or tires or supplies, like that kind of stuff takes somebody else to take time to do it. So make sure that you take enough time to plan out sending stuff away, asking people how much it would cost, and then making your budget that way. Use a spreadsheet so that the numbers line up well. It's easy for the grant reviewer to follow the information. Where are your totals for the amount that you're requesting for grants? That's make it very clear. A lot of grants have a template, but if they don't, Excel, Google Docs, because I know Excel some people don't have, but Google the Drive, Google Docs has a lot of things to help you. They even have you could create a form and a survey through them for free. So things to think about. So the actual cost should be included. So if something costs, like the Sprinter van example here, it actually costs $5,735. Write that. Don't just round up of what it is, because it will be farther in your grant because it shows that you actually looked at the detail. Next slide. So personnel should be listed by the name, title, salary, wage, and percent of the time that their employment is dedicated to the project. So if a director isn't necessarily dedicated to your wheelchair basketball team the whole time, then you're going to have to say the percentage of this employee's time dedicates this much to this project. And so you'll see we put a breakdown so that you have an example. Like right now with COVID, there's a lot of organizations that can't hire new people right now. So that might be something like if a new staff is going to fill this position, list it by title and the same kind of how much time, how much money, etc. Contract staff, those people don't get benefits, so don't list benefits. But grants typically do not pay for this kind of stuff, like the vacation, and a lot of times they won't pay for the benefits. It just depends on the grant and what level of it. And some grants may require, and I know this is a lot of the federal grants, require like the BioSketch or VITA that people are doing, like what is their actual job title or what is their background so they can do that job. But it's not required by all. You'll see that a lot of the federal grants, they're a lot more detailed and paperwork oriented. Next slide. And then contractors should be determined in advance of projects. So this is a lot of our web people, IT people, And then a lot of times when we are hosting tournaments, we're like, oh, we have to feed this many people. Well, how many people are you going to feed? How much is it going to cost? Do you, just like Cheryl said, breaking it down like staff, volunteers, so that you see actually that this cost is not just to the players, but all the other people and how it quickly adds up to more. Next slide. This is where we were saying, like, whatever you're asking for the grant, that's what you list. Don't add non-project items to budget. Never charge grants for equipment that you already have or purchased. Never charge two funding sources for the same line item. If you're audited, they will catch it. If there is an established indirect rate, it does not require detail. But typically grants do not want to cover the administration costs. So that's where, especially when we're talking about Christopher Reeves, Craig H. Nielsen, all of those grants, a lot of them have like no more than 10% could go to administration costs. As a grant writer, you can ask for some money, but it's usually like you could maybe say 5% of this budget will go towards grant writing, but not a lot of grants will cover that. Next slide. And then this is just an example of like putting the item. So for us, the facility, how long we'll be using it. Some people use it for 12 months. Some people use it for 9. It just depends on what you're doing. $1,000 per month. And then, you know, that's a total of 9,000. So you can see how this is broken down, how you can write it. It's just an example for you all to see how detailed a lot of budgets should be, so that they can see that you really thought about each part of it and you're not just making numbers up. And then Cheryl's the next slide. You could.
So we're going to skip talking about sustainability because I don't think that's a big issue to most organizations, and it's certainly not a big issue to Nielsen Foundation at this point. So if you go to the next one, and this one's just a commercial that when you go to submit your application, be ready, have someone that has not read, that's not part of your group, read the grant and tell you whether it makes any sense to them at all. Ask somebody to edit, you know, somebody that's an English major or just, you know, is good at it. Ask them to edit it, see the typos, see the formatting, see the grammar. Make sure you number the pages. If there's a limit on the number of pages, stick to that limit. Back in the day with federal grants, when we had paper ones, if you wrote, the limit was 15 pages and you wrote a 17-page grant, we didn't read the last 2 pages. So you really need to stick, because here's what we think, is if you can't follow the guidelines and you can't read the instructions, are you really going to be able to carry out a quality grant? So how somebody submits and gets everything in really reflects on their grant writing in general. The biggest thing I can tell you is whatever day the grant deadline is, you set your deadline for at least the day before, if not 2 days before. Nobody knows whether you got the grant in early or late. That won't have anything to do with whether you get the grant or not. But it would be a shame, and it has been a shame to a lot of people, to not be able to submit trying to submit that grant at 9 o'clock at night, and your electricity, these are the stories I've heard. My electricity went off, my internet access went down, my computer froze up, the dog ate my homework. We hear amazing number. Last week we accepted 83 grants for our research foundation. At 9:30 at night on the East Coast, a researcher called in and said, I found 2 typographical errors in my application. Could you please unlock my application so I can fix those 2 typos? Well, the way we do our grants, you have to actually have a signing official fill out your grant. Approve your grant. So we said, well, we'll open it for you if you think you can get your signing official to come back on, go to her office and sign back on and approve the grant again. And he decided maybe he wouldn't need to do that. But don't expect that there'll be good tech service. If you're putting the grant together at 9 o'clock at night, most of our tech services end at 5 or stop working at 5 o'clock. So if you can't get it to download, And those of us who live in an Apple world, a lot of these programs that they use, Nielsen in particular, don't speak to Apples as well as they do to PCs. So, you know, it will take, you can do it, but it'll take you a little bit longer. So once you've submitted the grant, be done with it. Submit it and forget it, because it's going to be quite a while before you hear back. So let's go to the next slide. So this talks about some of the things that we look at in terms of when we're reviewing grants. And the two really big ones are feasibility. Have you convinced us that you're the organization that can accomplish the mission and the activities that you have laid out in the grant? Do you have the people? Do you have the resources? Have you described it well enough that we think you know what you're doing? And then impact. If you submit a grant to Paralyzed Veterans of America, you better say this grant or this project will have impact on veterans who live with spinal cord disabilities in this way. If you apply for a Nielsen Foundation grant, they want to know that it will have impact on individuals who live with spinal cord disabilities. Now for Nielsen, they're a spinal cord injury organization. That's what they're trying to do. Does that mean if you have a team that has players who live with spina bifida or players who live with amputations that you can't apply for a Nielsen Foundation grant? No, it does not mean that. However, you need to be able to reflect that you have a good number, like probably half of the participants in the program are people who live with spinal cord injuries. So I think that means if you're going to do a clinic, you better say that, you know, you're going to do a clinic that has special sessions for class 1s and class 2s so that they know that those are the people that are the people that with the most disabilities are going to get the most time and effort. So they want to know, does it impact people? Is it going to fill a void? Is there really a lack? Is there really a need in your area? And then is what you're asking for going to have an impact? You know, $100,000 grant is not going to solve homelessness. $100,000 grant will not impact a lot of things, but for the kinds of things we're talking about, it probably will. But you really want to use the word impact and talk about the impact that this has had on these individuals. Let's go to the next slide. So then you're going to wait. You're going to wait 3 months. You're going to wait 6 months. Please don't call us. It's not going to do you any good. Every grant should say people will be notified. Applicants will be notified by May the 1st. Don't call me at 5 o'clock on May the 1st if you haven't heard. Check your junk mail first to make sure that my letter isn't there. I would say wait at least 4 or 5 days after the last day they say. But if it gets to be May 7th and you haven't heard anything, then it's perfectly appropriate for you to call and say, you know, I applied for this grant. I haven't heard anything back. You know, I didn't hear anything by the deadline. Could you tell me what the status is? Emails get lost. Emails go to junk and spam and all of that. And so, you know, it's not, everybody tries to provide you with information. Usually, if you get the grant, you're ecstatic. If you don't get the grant, you usually, and particularly from the Nielsen Foundation, because I end up writing a lot of them, we will send you a little summary that tells you what our concerns were and what the problems we saw were. So, you know, if you're going to apply again, you want to use that information. You know, it's kind of program evaluation. You want to use that information as you're going to the next step. I would, before we finish, so if you get once you get the grant, then, you know, a staff person will work with you. There's a lot of work that goes to start working with a contract, agreeing to things, submitting things. You might have to submit pictures. You might have to submit your 501c3. Well, you do have to submit that when you even apply, but they may ask for other documents. We ask for a contract, we asked for a lay summary and pictures and that kind of thing that we can use to promote grants. So people ask for different things. If you get a grant, you want to do those things. You want to carry it out like you said you were going to. Just a commercial for the Nielsen Foundation grant. People might think, well, gosh, this team got a Nielsen Foundation grant, that team got a Nielsen Foundation grant. How many are they going to give to wheelchair basketball teams? They're going to give as many as submit quality grants. It's not a competition between two teams. If you write a good grant and the people in the next state write a good grant, you're both going to get a grant. I can count on my fingers and toes, I think, the number of wheelchair basketball team grants that we've gotten in the last 5 years. So I would urge you to apply for a Nielsen Foundation grant if you have an idea and you meet all of these criteria. And we've gone way over time, but I'm going to turn it over to Darlene to finish up with some other options and opportunities we found.
Christina, go ahead. I think you're 2-3 slides in.
Yeah, I think there's at least 2 more.
And then go again.
Oops.
Oh, I think I lost it. So they're going to be posted online. It was just 2 more slides. One was Christopher Reeves, and the other one, just so you know the deadlines that are coming up. It's Christopher Reeves and Kelly Brush Foundation. I just put a couple more slides together. Will and Christina will post it online so you guys can have it. With that, thank you for your time. I don't know, Christina or Will takes over now for Q&A.
And just so you know, on the NWBA website, there is a list of 10 or 15 other grant opportunities with the links of how to link to those opportunities. I think the Variety Children's and some others are on there. So if you haven't started looking, that would be a good place to get started with the ones we've mentioned, which are some of the same that are on that list. So good luck. It's not as intimidating as it sounds. And when you write the first one and you get funded, it's an amazing feeling. Maybe not like winning a national championship, but pretty darn good. Thank you.
So I just want to say thank you to Darlene and Cheryl and everybody that tuned in tonight. This will be posted on the NWBA website. We hope it was informative. You all will be getting an email again for our next webinar series. That one is due to launch on July 21st. That's going to be about coaching education. So be on the lookout for an announcement about that. And Will, if you have anything else to say, I will give it to you.
No, if anyone had questions and you didn't get a chance to ask them, or if you think about questions after the fact, we can get those questions routed to Cheryl and Darlene. I really want to thank everyone for making the time, and thank Cheryl and Darlene once again for their time and putting together really high quality materials. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Take care.
Bye.
Lee Montgomery signing off. I gotta figure out